I can still remember my mother's look when I told her I wanted to invite Lucy to spend the holidays with us. She furrowed her brow in that way that she often did when she thinks something is a bad idea. Are you sure you want to invite Lucy, dear? Of course I'm sure. Lucy's my best friend, Mum. She let the water run over her hands for a few seconds, washing the potatoes she'd been making for dinner. I know she's your best friend, dear, but Lucy can be a little much sometimes. How long will she be staying? This was an odd question for my mother. She was usually charitable, but I knew this was the time of the year that always made her nervous. It was the 29th of December. Christmas is now in the rearview mirror, and New Year's looming on the horizon. None of this mattered, though, because my family was 4 days into celebrating the 12 nights of Christmas. My family's Christian, but the sect we belong to believes in the significance of the 12th night. The 12th night was marked by the Feast of Epiphany, and we spent most of the day at service, singing songs and praising God. On the 12th night, we always held a large meal, and Mother always made the turtle to celebrate the occasion. That's also the night that Frau Perchta visits us, and that could be a tumultuous time all of its own. Not a lot of people celebrate the 12th night. Christmas is usually the highlight of the season, but it's a religious tradition that my mother and father brought from France when we moved here. It's been a part of my life for so long that it just seems normal to me. To my knowledge, Lucy's family was not religious at all, so Lucy was looking forward to seeing what other holidays were like. Her family will be back on the 10th, just in time for the end of Christmas, I said, almost pleading for her not to reconsider. My mother looked at her potatoes as she worked. She knows that it's not all fun and games, right? We go to church a lot those days, and the celebration is mostly religious. Yes, I assured her, she knows it's not all fun and games. That wasn't a complete lie. Lucy had been interested in my family's quaint holiday customs, and I had tried to impress upon her that this time of year was very important to my family. There had been a lot of questions in my class about the 12 nights of Christmas. I told them how it had more to do with the nativity play and less to do with the song. I told them how we had the turtle, a pastry with a pea in it, and how if you found the pea, you got to be the queen for the evening. I usually found it, and my parents made a game of me being the queen for the night and parading me around the house. Lastly, I told them about Frau Perchta, the old woman who would visit on the 12th night and give out presents to good children. I believed this was the reason that Lucy wanted to stay with me instead of Chelsea or Maggie, her two other friends. Lucy saw an opportunity to get a second Christmas of sorts, and she wanted to use my holiday to get more presents. I wasn't too offended by this idea. I liked extra gifts too, but the idea of her using Frau Perchta to get them made me feel a little funny. Not really guilty, but not good either. Lucy was used to dealing with the kind of generous gift givers like Santa Claus. Frau Perchta was not a benevolent, jolly being. The Frau was honestly a little scary, and I had only just gotten comfortable around her myself. She was a gift-giving entity, which was nice, but she was also a stick that my parents would use to correct me when I was bad. Unlike Santa, the Frau was not just a Christmas entity either. The Frau was always watching, always judging, and they used her year-round lest I step out of line. Better behave, Frau Perchta will see. Put that candy back, you wouldn't want me to tell the Frau. Better go to sleep before Frau Perchta knows you're being naughty. I had never incurred the wrath of the Frau. My mom had said she would switch me if I were naughty. Mom also told stories of a sister that had gone missing after being especially willful one year. She had never seen her again, and her own mother had always claimed that it was the Frau's doing. Frau Perchta was a coin with two faces, and one of those faces had teeth. Mom nodded stiffly. Far be it from me to turn guests away during the holidays. Just make sure she's on her best behavior. You know how the Frau feels about willful children. I shuddered as she said the words, remembering the sister she never saw again. Lucy arrived 2 days later, and her parents thanked us for agreeing to let her stay. They were going to see friends out of town, places where Lucy would be relegated to a back room of strange children while their parents gathered. They offered my parents money for her food and board, but they waved it away. Lucy was our guest, and they were glad to have her. Her parents smiled at that, kissing their daughter goodbye as they were off to the airport to catch a flight. My parents had helped Lucy up to my room. Lucy had brought enough luggage for a month, and her luggage seemed to bulge with unnecessary clothes. I showed her the cot we had set up for her, and the spot in my closet I had emptied out for her clothes. She made appreciative noises right up until my parents left, and then she scoffed at the idea of sleeping on a saggy old cot. I saw her eyeballing my canopy bed before she made her intentions known. As a guest, it would only be generous for you to let me use your bed. But then where am I going to sleep? I asked, not quite understanding the trade-off. There was no way that we could share the bed. The mattress fell too short for me sometimes. I looked at the floor, but wrinkled my nose at the idea of sleeping there. I wasn't a messy child, but sleeping on the floor was still a great way to roll over on a Lego or a Barbie shoe. Well, why don't you sleep on the cot? It'll be like you're on holiday, she said, setting her bag on the foot of the bed and telling me about the Barbies she'd brought and the DVDs we could watch. I just sighed and took my princess blanket and pillow and sat up on the cot. This was going to be a long few weeks. My mother thought it was very sweet of me to let Lucy use the bed. I smiled and told her it was the right thing to do for a guest. The cot was lumpy, and I slept poorly on the sagging camp mattress. I thought mean things about Lucy every time I saw her snug in my bed, but I was careful to cut those kinds of thoughts off pretty quick. Such things might be willful, and I wasn't sure if Frau Perchta could read minds. I wasn't in a big hurry to find out, either. The first week went by pretty quickly. Lucy and I played with dolls, watched cartoons in our PJs, helped Mom around the house, and spent our nights giggling and telling secrets. Lucy was always polite and well-behaved around my parents, but she could be a bit of a brat in private. She complained that our house was too small and our food was too bland. It was too cold in here, and the service we dragged her to every night was too dull. I had seen my father shoot her dark looks as she sat in the pew beside me and sighed or fidgeted, but he was too kind to ever say much. She seemed to find our services quaint but boring, and was always ready to go when it was time to leave. On New Year's, Mom and Dad let us stay up with them so we could see the midnight ball drop and toast the New Year with sparkling cider. We sat in front of the TV, watching the New Year's special and waiting for midnight. Lucy told me about how last year she and her parents had been in Paris for the New Year, and her mother had let her drink some champagne when the clock struck midnight. I asked her what it had tasted like, and she said, too low for my parents to hear, it tasted better than this gross juice, and stuck her tongue out as she laughed. When she went to set her glass down, I saw it tip over and spill onto the carpet. She picked it up quickly, and my mother saw the stain before she saw the glass. "Oh no! Who spilled grape juice on the carpet?" she asked. Lucy pointed the finger at me. "It was an accident, ma'am. She didn't mean to." I started to become indignant, but Lucy gave me a pitiful look that communicated clearly that she did not want to get in trouble. I didn't say anything, and Mom made me get a towel to help clean it up. When they yelled, "Happy New Year!" I looked up quickly, having missed the ball drop. I didn't whisper to Lucy that night. I think she knew I wasn't happy with her. The second week was the worst. Lucy began to complain about the daily trips to church, and even my father's good mood was starting to stretch thin. We had neighbors who agreed to watch her while we went to church. I was honestly a little glad for the time away from Lucy. Her outbursts and snarky attitude were funny at school, usually making teachers grind their teeth and other students laugh. At home, she just came off as a brat and kind of mean. After that, she mostly laid around in her pajamas and did whatever she wanted. Her complaints about our food being too bland or being the same thing every day were starting to wear on my mother as well. I could see her counting the days until Lucy's parents would come to get her, and I had started looking forward to her leaving as well. Mom became a little weird where Lucy was concerned. I heard her calling her parents a few times, telling them how Lucy was missing them, and asked when they were coming back. Lucy had made no such claims. She was clearly enjoying being our guest, and her parents coming back was the farthest thing from her mind. Despite Mom's best efforts, it appeared that Lucy would be with us through the weekend. Mom didn't seem happy about this, and I wondered if she was worried what the Frau would make of Lucy. I wasn't happy with Lucy, but I didn't want her to disappear. The day of the 12th night arrived, and the house was filled with the low excitement that always came around this time of year. Mom and Dad were cleaning wildly, Mom taking breaks to cook the meal for tonight. Lucy and I were relegated to my bedroom so the house could stay clean. Lucy complained about this, of course, and kept asking me questions about the feast. What kind of food would we have? When would the princess cake be served? Which is what she started calling the turtle. Would the Frau be here to give presents before or after the meal? Would we have to go to church to get the gifts? She went on and on and on until I finally told her I didn't know. I was tired of her being here, and I kind of wanted her to leave. Mom had the food ready before we left for service that night, and laid the turtle out under a bowl to cool. The sitter made her way over, giving Lucy a look that clearly said she regretted promising to watch her, and we left for church. The Christmas service was always beautiful. The choir sang hymns, and Mom made me a beautiful white dress for the service. The pastor read a sermon about the birth of Christ and his presentation to the temple. He talked about how on the day of the Epiphany, the 12th day, it was revealed that Jesus was the incarnation of God the Father, and how this was a momentous occasion for people so that they could have a personal relationship and not depend on the temple of priests. I listened intently, having heard the story before, but I always enjoyed the pastor's stories about the life of Christ. I was a little sad when it ended, knowing that I would have to go back to Lucy and her meanness. I closed my eyes before leaving and asked Jesus to help me. I asked him to take this burden away from me, which was something I had heard people say before. Maybe I should have been a little more careful with my prayers. Lucy was dressed in a similar white dress when we got home, a gift from my family to hers for the feast. The sitter left, waving and thanking my mother for the $10 she handed her, but going in a hurry without a backwards glance. Lucy complained about the dress almost at once, saying it didn't fit right and it was too baggy for her. She said the hem was too long and that she kept tripping over it. My mother mostly ignored her as I helped her get the food onto the table. Then we prayed over the meal and sat down to enjoy our feast. Mom had made the red wassail for the occasion. The warm apple cider tasted great after being out in the cold. There were mashed potatoes, ham, fruits and vegetables, both stewed and raw, pies, roast, and of course the turtle, which sat as the centerpiece. We all dug in, and it was the first time I had heard Lucy stop talking in days. She ate a little of everything, her eyes sliding again and again to the turtle, and who could blame her? The pastry glistened with sugar and looked delicious. When we'd all eaten as much as we could, Mom cut the turtle and served us all a piece. Remember, if you find the pea, you get to be royalty for the evening, she reminded us. We all dug in, savoring the tasty tart, and I expected to find the pea with every bite. I think, even then, I believed that my parents let me have the pea every year, so I could be princess of the feast. As I saw my tart becoming smaller and smaller, I began to wonder if they had moved it this year. Lucy was eating as well, but I saw her hand slip into her pocket as she ate, clenching something. Suddenly she sat up, bringing her hand out of her pocket and proclaiming that she had found the pea. I could only gape as my parents congratulated her. Had she just cheated to become the princess of the feast? I didn't have long to gape, however, since as she turned to me, grinning, there was a light tap on our door. Mom stiffened, looking at Lucy and me saying, "Frau Perchta has arrived." She and Dad left the table, heading for the door, but I stopped Lucy as she started to get up. "You cheated! Why would you do that?" I was less mad than hurt, honestly. Lucy was our guest. We had treated her far better than she had treated us, and this was just needless. I would have let her share the title with me if I had won, but for her to cheat to win was just... My young mind didn't have a word to describe it then. I simply couldn't make sense of why she would do this. Duh! Your parents would have probably just given you the piece with the pea in it. While you were at church, I lifted the corner and saw it in the piece that your mom gave to you. So I took it and put it in my pocket for later. It wouldn't be fair for you to just win, so I cheated, just like your parents were going to. Now step aside, peasant. The princess is off to get her presents. And with that, she skipped off towards the living room. I had little choice but to follow after her. The Frau was seated in the living room when I arrived. Frau Perchta, as I've said, had always scared me a little. She was dressed in a habit, a long white shawl covering her face and framing her ghostly mask that she always wore. The mask was made of dark wood, looking ancient and resembling a smiling ogre. She was hunched, using a cane to get around, and she leaned forward in the chair as she beckoned me towards her with a gnarled hand. "Come forward, child." I took a step, her voice sounding like dry leaves in a hollow log. Lucy stepped forward instead, however, standing before the Frau and jutting her chin out. "Hey, I was here first. I get my gifts before her." My mother sucked in a breath, and my father's eyes got very wide as his skin seemed to pale. The mask bent to look at Lucy, and the wooden thing did not seem to like what it saw. "Run along, child. You are not of my ilk, and I would not judge you by my rules." Lucy huffed out an angry breath. "Hey, I was promised presents from you. What, I don't get presents just because I'm not part of this place?" The wearer of that mask sucked in a long, suffering breath and looked at Lucy icily. "Clearly, you are not part of this place, child. If you were, you would know it was wise to treat me with respect when I honor a household with my presence." "Oh, so I'm just supposed to accept that you didn't bring me anything?" She brought the pea out of her pocket and waved it in front of the mask. "I am the princess of the feast, and I want my gift. I'm royalty today, and you can't tell a princess no," she said haughtily. Her bluster melted away when the old woman's hand whipped around her slender neck. "Even if you were the grandest princess in all the land, I answer to a higher power, and I will not be spoken to in such a way. You wish to have my gifts? Please prepare to receive them." She stood, stooped no longer, and carried Lucy's struggling body over to the coffee table. She shoved the magazines and knickknacks off of it and slammed the struggling girl onto the surface. I looked at my parents, but both of them were frozen in horror and surprise. I screamed for them to do something, and my voice seemed to galvanize them. My father looked at Mother, nudging her and whispering something to her that seemed to bring her out of her trance. She moved in front of me, blocking the scene from view and whispering soothing words to me as my friend gagged and screamed. Through the crook of my mother's arm, I could see the old woman take a knife from beneath her robes and lift it over the struggling girl. Her reddening face was terrifying, seeing the knife preparing to gut her as she struggled all the harder. The old woman's grip was like iron, though, and as she tried to line up her blade, she seemed to be having trouble through the mask. The tip hooked beneath the lip of that wooden mask and swung it up to sit on her head, and it was then that she seemed to notice me. She looked at my mother, her dry voice cracked out, bringing her back around to face her. "Do not shelter that girl. Let her see what befall those who will cross the white." Mom looked down at me, clearly not wanting me to see what was about to happen, but moved aside obediently. When I caught sight of the Frau's face, I put my hands to my mouth to stifle a scream. The ogre mask was an improvement compared to what lay beneath. Her gaunt face was skeletal, the nose little more than a flap of skin, and that skin was ice blue and stretched over her skull like wax paper. Her teeth were sharp, like little stones in her mouth, and she held my eyes with a pair of crystalline blue ones that nearly gave me frostbite. She released me a moment later, bending to the struggling girl she was holding against my mom's coffee table, and lifting the knife to get to work. Lucy struggled frantically. She was aware, it seemed, that this was no joke, and that neither my parents nor her parents were going to swoop in to save her. Lucy had found someone who would not give her a pass because she was young and pretty. She had found a creature to which these things did not matter. Lucy had learned too late that sometimes it's best not to keep poking the bear when it's given you a chance to run. When the knife came down, it seemed to surprise her all over again. Her white dress began to soak with blood, the blade cutting through her abdomen and slitting her belly open. The old woman cut into her guts, sticking the knife blade first into the table and dragging out handfuls of ropey entrails. She threw them on the ground, Lucy twitching and convulsing as her life bled away. Her face had gone from red to purple, and her eyes bugged out as the lack of air caught up with her. It seemed the blood loss won out, though, because I saw her bulging eyes roll up to the whites as her purple face slackened into a death mask. She went limp, head lolling to the side, and the Frau reached behind her to grab a scratchy bag from beside the chair. She upended the sack, spilling sticks and pine cones, old wrappers and vegetable peels into the opening before taking out a long bone needle and stitching Lucy closed. She did this with amazing speed, years of practice, I suppose. The Frau sewed up Lucy as her dead eyes stared at the creature's habit, the fabric unstained by blood or gore. When she finished, Frau Perchta sat in her chair once more and motioned me over. I didn't want to go. I had just seen the woman kill one of my best friends, but my mom pushed me towards her and gave me a nervous look that said all it needed to. I approached her chair on rubbery legs, trying not to look at Lucy's bloated form as I passed her. The Frau held out her hand, the blue fingers streaked with gore, and I heard the clink of coins. I held out my own shaky hand, not wanting her to touch me, and she let 4 large gold coins fall into my hand. They too were bloodied, my gift holding its own little warning as she offered it to me. "You are such a good child. Know that I am pleased by your charity and your pure heart. Fear not. I will take care of that one," she said, indicating Lucy. "But you will need to make the proper excuses," she said to my mother and father. They both nodded and shunted me up to bed, my numb fingers still gripping the coins. I don't know how I managed to sleep after all that, but as the adrenaline wore off, I found my eyes growing heavy, and it was morning before I knew it. I expected to find Lucy in my room, fast asleep in her blankets, but she and her things were all gone. Her bags had been taken away, her bedding and her clothes were missing, and when I went downstairs, the living room was spotless. My parents were in the kitchen, their garb from the night before nowhere to be seen. My mother was on the phone with the police, filing a missing persons report. Her voice held nothing but honest emotion, and that's likely why nothing was ever said about the incident, other than regret. "She left in the night, officer. We woke up to find her things gone and the front door open." "Well, she had been feeling homesick, but we didn't think she'd actually run away. We've searched for her since dawn, since my husband noticed she was missing." "No, not a sign of her." "Yes, I called her mother to let her know, and they're on their way back now." Yes, please, officer. If you find anything, let us know. Thank you so much." She hung up the phone and sat with my father at the table, both of them looking at me. "Sweetie, we need to talk about what happened last night." They told me everything. She told me an old story about how Frau Perchta would reward good children and punish those who were willful. Mom told me that she had seen her sister punished in just that same way, the same way Lucy had been. The body and the mess gone before morning, but not forgotten, and certainly not gone forever. They found her body a few months later, buried in a snowdrift. It was one of the reasons that I left the community when I was old enough. The police might not know what happened to her, but I did, and the community certainly did. When the coroner found sticks and rocks sewn into her, the community knew that my mother had raised one of the willful ones. I had hoped that by leaving, I would be able to free myself of the traditions of my people, but when the Frau arrived at my door on my first feast away from home, I knew that there would be no escaping her. She looked at me, her eyes full of pity and resolve. "You will have to do the same. This is your life now. It won't end just because you leave it. The Frau is our burden, the gift given by my family generations ago, and she cannot be escaped. When you have children of your own, you must remember this night and raise them to respect the white. You know the consequences of failure now. If the police ask you what happened to Lucy, just tell them the truth. Tell them you haven't seen her since last night, and leave it at that." And so I did. So I have been doing for years now. I'm a married woman with children of my own now, and I have raised them to both revere and fear the yearly visits of Frau Perchta. My children are good kids, but I will never make the same mistake my mother made on that day when I was young. I will never allow outsiders to stay at my house for the holiday. I will never let my children know the dark secret that I keep inside. Okay, so this is really weird, and I don't know what to do about it. I don't even know if anyone will ever read this, but it's all I can do to keep my mind intact. I've been wandering the streets for weeks, unable to re-enter my home. I've never been what you'd call a motivated person. I was a solid C student in high school, college dropout, and I work at Kinko's full-time to pay my shoddy one-bedroom apartment rent and my meager food bills. I was never hurting, not really. I just didn't really have much of a direction, I suppose. My parents bemoaned the way I live constantly. They tell me I had such potential when I was a kid. I had good grades, my writing was so talented, I had so many opportunities. I excelled at baseball and track. I've probably still got some spelling bee trophies I won throughout elementary school somewhere around here. The world was my oyster, and it seemed like middle school would be a continuation of my excellence. Then, I discovered World of Warcraft. I know, it's a cop-out, but the game kinda took over my life. Suddenly, I didn't care about tests. I didn't care about extracurriculars, and if I still wrote, it was fanfic about the game that I loved. This affair started in 6th grade, and my parents are probably still kicking themselves for paying my subscription fees. Suddenly, my own priorities seemed to be doing my chores so I could get enough allowance to keep paying for my monthly subscriptions. I would spend hours online, which only worsened as I grew older. I was actually playing World of Warcraft when it happened. I had gotten off of work an hour ago, and I had hit the game as soon as I got home. My guild was raiding, and I was settling in for 8 hours of solid gaming. I was off the next day, so I could sleep tomorrow away if I wanted to. What did I have to get up for anyway? All my friends were online, so sleeping until I finally felt like getting up sounded pretty good to me. When the weird light started emanating from behind me, I thought it was my lava lamp at first. I started hearing someone talking, someone behind me as opposed to over my headset, and I glanced behind me to see a strange, wavering portal. It was like looking too far down the road on a hot day, and it seemed to shimmer over the dirty floor to my bedroom. There were two people standing in it. One of them was a tall man in a suit and a top hat, casting his hand to me as though showing something to the other. The other was a child, barely older than 12, looking confused in his pajamas. My eyes grew a little wider. That kid was me.
See what your future holds if you stay on this path. Your dreams, your ambitions, all gone as you wallow in perpetual stagnation.
The younger me looked around, seeming horrified, before begging the man to take him home.
As you wish.
And suddenly, they were gone. I sat there, listening to my guildmaster ask if I was still there. What the hell had that been? It had ended as quickly as it had begun, and left me thinking that something otherworldly had just happened. I had seen myself at the age just before I had given up, but I had no memories of what had happened. No one had ever visited me and taken me on a Dickensian look into my future. It had never happened, and yet I had seen myself seeing me, and the feeling of horror on that young face had been startling. I tried to get back into the game, but the thoughts of that little kid looking at me with real horror kept distracting me. A few minutes later, I told them I felt sick and took myself off to bed. I lay there thinking about what I had seen, wondering if it had all been a dream or a delusion or what the hell had happened. The look on the youngster's face had been deeply troubling, and I just couldn't shake it. What had that even been? Why didn't I remember it? I went to sleep thinking of these things, and they followed me into my dreams. I slept poorly that night. The strangeness started the next day. I had woken up at 1 o'clock in the afternoon and sat down with a bowl of cereal. I was ready to play for the day. I had sort of put the event of the night before out of my mind and decided that it was just something I had dreamed up. I had felt sick last night and dreamed about seeing a ghostly figure. My brain knew otherwise, but I had gotten pretty good at deluding myself after convincing myself that things were fine for so long. It started with something easily overlooked. I logged in and started trying to find a group for one of the lower level characters I was playing. I wanted to run a specific dungeon, but they seemed to ignore me when I asked to join their group. I thought it was kind of rude, but the longer it went on, the madder I got about it. I raged about it in chat, but it also went uncommented on there. I changed characters, thinking maybe it was a glitch, but I was still roundly ignored by everyone. After about an hour, I gave up and logged off. I tried playing other games I enjoyed, but no one seemed to see or comment on anything I said in-game. It was like I was invisible. I went down to the corner store to get something to eat, a pack of ramen and a sandwich, and I had to smack the counter a few times before the guy behind it would look at me. He was stocking cigarettes, but I know he saw me. I asked him why he didn't acknowledge me sooner, but he just told me to have a nice day and wandered off. After I ate, I went back to bed, and I lay there fuming. I wish, now, that I had only been limited to being overlooked in games. The next day I had to work. I got up at 9, showered, ate breakfast, and put my uniform on. I thought about calling in. I was still kind of put out from yesterday, but I decided against it. Maybe a day of work would make me feel a little better. People would have to notice me if I was at work, right? I grabbed my keys and headed out to Kinko's. It started to become more noticeable when I got to work. At first, a coworker wouldn't say hi to me. Then it was time to clock in, but the time clock refused to let me clock in with my thumbprint. I went to Mary, my boss, but she just ignored me. I shouted and pushed things off her desk, and only that seemed to really draw her attention. She asked what the hell I was doing, and when I told her I couldn't clock in, she asked who I was. I looked at her, unbelieving. I've worked at this Kinko's for 7 years. Mary's the one who hired me. I told her my name after she started getting rude about it, and she typed it in and just shook her head. Sorry, looks like you don't work at this location. Are you supposed to start at the Francis Park store today or something? I cut her off, though. I told her that I had worked here for 7 years, I told her we'd interacted almost daily since I started. I had literally been to her house, swam in her pool, gone to high school with her son. She stared at me blankly and said she had no idea who I was. She suggested that I check with the Francis Park store, but told me I would have to leave. After a little more arguing, she threatened to call the cops if I didn't leave immediately. Thinking back on it, she wasn't even really angry when she threatened to call the police. She spoke to me in that way you might boredly tell someone that it's time they left. She never looked up from her work, simply wanting the momentary nuisance of me to go away. When I left, she never even acknowledged it. I went home in a rage, not understanding what was going on, but my mind kept returning to that kid and the man in the top hat. Maybe it was the time of the year, but the whole thing made me feel very Scrooge-like. Had not Ebenezer Scrooge been shown his future by a ghost? Perhaps I was the future yet to come. I shook my head, trying to get it out of my brain. The whole thing was just too weird, too Dickensian. The mood wasn't helped by the reception I received online. People ignored me again, the very thing I had already been mad about. And even worse, some of them asked where I was. They claimed they hadn't seen me in a few days and were starting to get worried. Others claimed they thought they had seen me online yesterday, but they couldn't be sure. I told them I was here, asked what sort of game they thought they were playing, but they didn't respond. I finally logged out and went to get some takeout. If I couldn't drown my sorrows in online games, I would drown them in cheap Chinese food. When I reached for the door, though, there was a moment of vertigo as my hand slipped through the knob. I pulled it away like a kid who's touched a hot stove, but when I reached again, my hand gripped it this time, and I turned it normally. I looked at it for a few seconds, knowing what I had seen, but not quite believing it. I closed the door behind myself, wondering vacantly if I'd be able to get back in again. As I walked down the road, the garish lights of Christmas twinkled about me. It suddenly hit me that it was December 21st, and I hadn't bought a single thing for my parents. I hadn't gotten them anything the year before that either, but it was weird that they hadn't called to ask if I'd be around for Christmas. As I walked down the sidewalk, people avoided me easily, none of them so much as grunting at me, or excusing themselves, or telling me to get the hell out of the way. It was the holidays, but people usually told you to fuck yourself when you got in their way in my town. I was beginning to feel unwanted, if not a little unseen, as I slumped my shoulders and continued on. The trip was ultimately fruitless anyway. I stood in line at the restaurant, but the guy behind me stepped up to order instead as I approached the counter. The guy at the register took no notice of me, and instead began to take his order. I shouted at them, banging on the counter, but they just ignored me. What the hell was going on? I shouted at the others in line, but no one so much as looked at me. Finally, I just turned to leave, reaching out to catch the door as it swung shut. The bar passed right through my hands, and I slid through the glass front as I stumbled out onto the street. I ran then, my frantic running attracting no attention. I wish it had been that easy to pass back into my apartment, but I never found it. I ran to my apartment complex, but my apartment was gone. The space was empty, a blank wall that had never had a door on it, but had indeed had a door on it barely an hour ago. No matter how much I slammed my hands against the wall, it refused to return to reality. After an hour of just leaning there, hoping for something, I turned and left. I've been on the streets ever since. I don't even know how long I've been here, but I see the lights and know that it's that time of year again. I walk the streets alone. No one notices me. No one speaks to me. It's as if I don't even exist. I've been living in the library that I used to go to when I was a kid, reading books and trying to muster the strength to write this. You see, it's like that scene out of the movie Ghost. If I concentrate very, very hard, I can turn a page or strike a key on the computer. It gets easier the more I practice, but it takes a toll sometimes. I've been typing my story for quite some time now, hiding it on the librarian's computer so she won't delete it. It's almost ready to post now, and I'm hoping that unlike my past friends, someone can see my final message. I've wondered long and hard, you see, about what happened to the characters in A Christmas Carol after Scrooge had his change of heart. Did they cease to exist, or did they live in this strange limbo like me? I wonder what my past self saw that was really so terrible. Am I such a nightmare that he felt he had to change his future so drastically? Did he return to the past and hurt himself in response to seeing how badly things were going for me? I don't know. I don't even know why I'm telling any of you this. I suspect it's simply for the purpose of telling you that I existed once, as much as I ever existed. When I'm finally allowed to be no more, I want someone to know that I was more, or less, I guess, than the ghost I am today. They say it's a legend, just a story we tell kids, but I'm here to tell you not to believe a word of it. You would do well to beware the Yule Cat, no matter what they say. My cousins and I grew up in the Icelandic countryside and spent most of our lives within a stone's throw of our birthplace. For 2 weeks in December, my saintly grandmother would welcome us into her home so my parents could go Christmas shopping or have some time to themselves. She had all my cousins as well, a brood of 8 when we were all assembled, and we made quite a house full. Many nights after Granddad had made his excuses for going off to the pub, Grandma would gather us around the fire and tell us stories. Stories about fairies and Queen Mab and her ilk, and of the elves and darker things that had once been part of this landscape. She told us stories of Icelandic heroes and filled our dreams with monsters that begged to be slain as we took on our favorite champion's role. But especially around the Christmas season, her favorite story was of the Yule Cat. He is a giant creature, capable of stepping over palisades and creeping into tall buildings. He punishes the lazy and rewards those who work hard and do their work year-round. If you neglect your duties, the Jólakaturin will find your children. Never doubt. His favorite meal is children without new clothes in the winter, their parents having spent their summers at leisure. Thankless children he hates as well, those who scorn their parents' work in favor of frivolous things. So be thankful, my children, that your parents work hard to keep such dark things away. Most of her stories about the Yule Cat involved naughty children who went into the woods at night, spoiled children whose parents found that the Yule Cat had dragged them out through their window and gobbled them up, and good children who were rushing home on Christmas Eve to get their clothes before the Yule Cat got them. My little brother Sven always held a deep fear of the Yule Cat, but I can honestly never remember a time when I was afraid of him. It always just seemed kind of goofy to me, and in my head I just imagined a giant cat with big wobbly legs that looked like big noodles. Its body was high in the air, and the legs just wiggled around beneath it. I had drawn a picture of it for my grandma once, and she only smiled and ruffled my hair. Let us hope that if your Jólakaturin finds you, he is as silly as you think he is. I had smiled about the idea of meeting the Yule Cat then, thinking of all the monsters and beasts my cousin and I had slain in our dreams. I'm not smiling as I write this, though. I came to live with my grandparents when I was 15. My father and mother had been killed in a car accident when a semi slid on the ice and hit them head on. They say they died instantly, but all I knew was that Sven and I were suddenly without parents. There was never any question of where we would go, of course. My grandmother opened her home to us without a second thought. With Grandpa 3 years in his grave, she said it would be nice to have some company, and we moved into her earthy little cottage. I lived with her until I was 23, attending university and getting my degree so I could begin a career in architecture. After graduation, I took up residence in my parents' old home so that I could maintain the family homestead. The house was on my grandparents' land, so it wasn't as though I never saw her again. Sven didn't like to go back to the old house, claiming that there were too many memories there, and my grandmother sheltered him quite a bit. When I moved back, I invited him to come live with me, but he declined. He was 17 and showed none of my ambition. I was worried that if he stayed, my grandmother would coddle him forever, but that was his decision to make. I moved back in around Christmas time, and I decorated my old house like it was my first Christmas ever. The lights and decorations were still in the crawl space, like they had always been, and as I put them up, I began to feel a heady sense of nostalgia. The tree stood in full view of the window, and I had bought enough presents for everyone this year. I had spent much of my life not having a lot of money, and now that I had a lucrative job, I decided to take advantage of the holiday season and spoil my relatives a bit. When I was done, my house had shone out against the darkness like a beacon. I was sitting snug by the fire, a cup of spiced hot chocolate in my hand and a slight buzz making my mind slippery, when the phone rang. My grandma's smiling picture showed from the home screen, and I picked it up as I tried to compose my voice. Grandma was used to people being a little drunk, but Granddad had been pickled more than he was sober during life, and I was still at that age where I was self-conscious about her seeing me like that. I answered the phone, and she immediately started with no greeting. "Care, you haven't come to get your Yule clothes. You need to come back now." I wasn't used to my grandma being so forceful. She was usually very mild, content to smile and let others do what they would. But she seemed upset about this in an irrational way. Tomorrow was Christmas Day. All my cousins and my family and everyone would gather for presents at Grandma's before the usual feast. What Grandma was referring to was her tradition of giving us clothes to keep the Yule Cat away. This was my first Christmas away from home. I usually got them from Grandma when I woke up on the 23rd, but I guess I had missed it since I moved out. "Oh, that's okay, Gran. I'll just get them tomorrow. I'll be there with the others. You can give them to me." "No, you have to come get them now, and hurry. I need you here before the sun goes down, or the Yule Cat will get you." I had rolled my eyes at this. "Gran, I think the Yule Cat will understand if I don't want to go out in the snow and get clothes. Can't I just get them tomorrow?" Her voice went from severe matriarch to pleading older woman in the blink of an eye. "Care, please. It's your first time away from home, and I want you to be safe. I can leave them on the porch if you don't want to come inside, but please come and get them." She sounded scared, and I couldn't argue. I told her I would get dressed and drive over before sunset, and she sighed in relief and thanked me. I dressed warmly in my snow pants and heavy coat. My muffler and gloves came on next, along with a pair of snow boots and a flashlight just in case. All of this went on over whatever I was already wearing, jeans and a t-shirt and thick socks, and I sighed forlornly as I stepped out in the ankle-deep snow. I put a hand on my old Jeep, but decided against it. My head was a little sloshy, and I knew it would only take a few minutes with the heat blasting before I was asleep and sliding on the icy road. Instead, I decided to walk to Grandmother's house, and it was only about 2 miles from here, in the bracing cold, which would sober me up before I got there. I set off towards the woods that separated her house from mine. Every time I walked those familiar trails, I always felt like I should be scattering breadcrumbs behind me. My grandmother's house lies sheltered in the woods, and they always feel so dense and foreboding whenever I have to walk through them. The snow and the cold made them quiet, the less hardy birds having left, and many of the other animals asleep for the winter. The tracks, however, told me that there were indeed things out here. My legs started to get tired almost at once. If you've never had to slog through deep snow, then I can tell you that it isn't much fun. As the sun began to set, I began to regret not taking the truck. I could hear the snow making the trees creak and sag, and now and again there was a scurry of movement as some small creature went about its business. Other than the occasional noise, it was as though I had the forest to myself, and my loud footsteps made me feel like the last person on earth. When I heard the snow crunch nearby, I swung to see what was there. The sound had startled me. My own feet were the only thing making much noise out here, but I found nothing. By the sound of the crunch, I would have thought it was a reindeer, or maybe a large bird trying to forage below the snow. In the dim light, I couldn't even see where the prints were, and I started slogging a little faster, worried it might be a wild dog or something. The crunching came again, but I shrugged it off as my mind playing tricks on me. When it crunched again, closer this time, I started moving even faster. Going too fast would be a great way to break an ankle or fall and impale myself on a tree limb, but the crunching and lack of a source was starting to freak me out. The snowing sky was already overcast, and the sun was setting behind me. The thought of being out here after dark made my skin crawl. The idea of getting lost in a stretch of wood that would become unnavigatable once the sun went down made me quicken my pace again. My footsteps were loud, cutting through the silence like a foghorn, but somehow I could still hear the steps behind me as I nearly jogged through the ankle-deep snow. What I had thought might be a reindeer or a wild dog now sounded like something much larger. It was very rare, but polar bears sometimes got stuck on ice floes and found their way over here. I had seen something online about it, I thought, and I could just see a big hungry polar bear loping behind me as it prepared to make a quick meal out of me. I didn't dare look back as I heard the crunch come down not 8 feet behind me. It hit the ground hard enough to dislodge snow from the trees, and I started booking it as best I could. What the hell was it? Iceland didn't have a lot of large predators, none that came this close to settled areas, and my mind began to travel back to a time when I was young and sitting warm around Grandma's fire. My cousins and I had always loved the stories about trolls and elves, stories of great heroes who slew the former and were aided by the latter, and we always took up sticks when we played and pretended to swing mighty swords at the knees of ugly, hulking trolls. The idea of being devoured by a large, slobbering troll, my mind showing me the one from Harry Potter, seemed less fun now that I was being chased by one through a fairy tale forest. I glanced behind me in a blind panic, not wanting to see, but wanting to know nonetheless, and I felt my boot sink into a hole. I went down, face first in the snow, and nearly headfirst onto a tree. I rolled over to face whatever was now surely going to get me, preparing to fight. My ancestors had been men who settled this land, men who rode onto the shores in boats with axes and tamed the wilderness, and I would be damned if I would die with my head in the snow like a blubbering baby. What I saw looming over me was no troll. What I saw looming over me was much, much worse. When I had drawn him, I had made his legs look like waving noodles. I had drawn him with a tabby cat coat and a pair of big, friendly yellow eyes. He had been given the Cheshire Cat's grin and a pair of pointy ears that made him look like Batman. He had looked friendly, goofy, something a child couldn't possibly be afraid of. The Yule Cat was none of those things. His coat was black as twice-baked charcoal, and his bones and muscles seemed to shift beneath it, like they might be something living under his skin. Its legs were long and powerful, like a panther or a jaguar, and its paws left tracks as big as hubcaps, with claws like stilettos. His mouth was filled with two big teeth, and the tips seemed to poke at his lips painfully, as its slaver ran pink from his jaws. Its ears had been mostly chewed off, sitting on its head like rounded nubs that barely seemed big enough to be ears at all. Its eyes, though, its eyes were the worst. Its yellow eyes blazed like torches, their centers crackling red, and when it loosed a long, loud yowl, I felt my snow pants fill with piss. I was saved by sheer dumb luck. Its yowl had loosed some of the snow from the tree over its head, and when it fell, it coated the Yule Cat's face in a cold blanket of surprise. I rolled away, and when I did, the beast lunged at me. It ran smack into the tree I had nearly fallen into and yowled again. More snow fell on it then, and the cat hissed angrily as its claws shredded the tree to pieces. I didn't wait around to be the next scratching post for this thing. I ran through the snow like a reindeer, churning it up as my fear gave me new purpose. I could see the smoke from Grandma's chimney, but I knew I had to be another quarter of a mile from the house. The shadows were gathering, and I knew that I was dead as soon as this thing got its bearings. When it came after me, I realized it had only been playing with me before. Its crunching step sounded dinosauric, and it cleared the distance between us easily. It swiped at me as I ran, and the claws slid easily through my thick jacket. The back suddenly felt cold as the goose down spilled out of it, and I began to realize that I was running on borrowed time. I had to find some way to lose it. I had to find some way to use its size against it. I needed a place to hide and catch my breath, my lungs burning and my head swimming with exertion. That's when I passed the Himmeltree and realized where I was. When we were children, there was a tall tree that we used as a landmark. We called it the Himmeltree, the sky tree, because it always seemed like it soared up into the clouds. My older cousins and I had hiked to the tree once, nearly a quarter of a mile into the woods, and found that the tree lived up to its name. It was massive, 60 feet of wood like iron, and beneath it was a series of roots that looked like a cage. The soil had pushed away from them, and as kids we would crawl beneath the tree and camp in relative comfort. The spot was large for children, but would be snug for me. I was hoping that it would be too snug for this hellcat as well. I booked it, running flat out as the tree soared up to greet me. I jumped over a sprawl of fallen trees, something I remembered from childhood, and prayed that maybe the cat wouldn't be so lucky. When I heard him hiss and stumble a moment later, I knew that his luck had run out. I didn't look to see how badly he had spilled. I fell on my belly and prayed that I had the angle right as I slid between the roots of the huge tree. I thumped my shoulder, the tough old root hurting as I hit them, but I made it mostly under the tree as the cat scrambled after me. I winced as his claws caught my leg, ripping through my snow pants and jeans to sink into meat, but I shook him off before he could pull me out and was soon snug beneath the wooden canopy of the huge old tree. The underside was just as I remembered it. It was damp from snow run, but the frozen snow had mostly covered it, so I was left in a crystalline world of domed white. The cat screamed in agony, shooting a paw between the roots and searching for me in frustration. I huddled against the side of the tree, not wanting to be found by those furtive claws, and stayed as still and quiet as I could. The scrambling went on for some time, but the cat finally removed its sooty paw. I heard it crunching off into the forest then, lumbering away like a large black shadow as it disappeared into the woods. I stayed still, fearing some trick, but it went right on moving until its heavy footsteps were only slight crunches in the distance. I stayed put though, blowing on my hands as my wet pants and bleeding leg began to make me shiver. I would freeze to death out here if I stayed too long, but I was afraid that the Yule Cat might double back and wait for me to leave. I shivered for as long as I could, feeling the temperature drop as the sun crept closer to down. Finally, I decided I'd rather be eaten than freeze to death. I crawled out, and when I wasn't immediately set upon, I started stumbling towards my grandmother's house. She was waiting in the doorway for me, a mug of spiced cider in her hand, and a concerned grimace spread across her face. "He found you out there, didn't he?" It wasn't a question, but I nodded anyway. I've been sitting by the fire and letting her feed me and nurse me back to health for a few hours. She bandaged my leg and took my shredded clothes away. She set a plate of food in front of me, and when I finished the spiced cider, she brought me tea and told me to rest. Before she went back to her room to sleep, she dropped a package on my lap. It was a new sheepskin coat, lovely to see and soft to touch. I couldn't imagine what it had cost her, though I knew what it had almost cost me. "He won't bother you now," she said, and made her way to bed as I sat convulsing by the fire. "So, heed your elders when they tell you the old stories. I was lucky, but you can't always count on luck. The Yule Cat still lurks in the hills and woods, searching for those he deems ungrateful and underdressed. Don't take the clothes you get for Christmas so lightly, because they could save your life if you find yourself in the sights of the Yule Cat." It seemed like every year, Kyle looked forward to the snow. Living in North Georgia, he usually found his front yard full of the stuff sometime around Thanksgiving. Kyle fondly remembered the year a blizzard blew in before Halloween, and they had to trick-or-treat in the snow. Kyle's Batman costume quickly got upgraded with a puffy jacket and some ski boots with snowshoes as he became some obscure Batman that his mom had found on one of those little toy checklists he had pinned to his wall. Kyle loved the snow and would spend hours playing outside, making forts and having snowball fights with his friends. He only really came in if his parents made him, and only then until he warmed up enough to go back out. Kyle's favorite thing of all was building the large, lumpy snowmen that seemed to be all children could manage in their chunky gloves with their limited motor skills. After the first snow of the season, his yard always seemed to be full of snowmen. Sometimes Kyle stuck plastic guns or swords in their stick hands and decorated them with plastic dollar store armor to make them knights, or cast them in green clothes to make them soldiers. His dad used to take pictures of them and send them to magazines for local color pieces, and Kyle couldn't remember a year that at least one of them didn't make it somewhere in the paper. Many of them also hung around the house. When he grew up, Kyle still found that he loved the snow, but he never built snowmen. All the magic was sapped out of it when he was 10. Kyle, Carl, and Reggie were building an army of snowmen in the front yard when Terry and his friends came to call. Kyle's mom had been to Habitat for Humanity and brought home a big cardboard box full of plastic swords, helmets, and breastplates. There were probably about 24 sets in the box, a birthday party idea that someone had grown tired of, and Kyle and his friends were setting about making snow knights. They kept a set of armor apiece for themselves, and once the knights were built, they would have fun pretending to be warriors and knocking them down. They had just set them all up and were slinging on their gear when Terry came down the road with his 3 friends. Terry, Bobby, Mark, and Dale went to school with them, and they were all kind of bullies. Of the 4, Terry was the worst, and Kyle suspected that the others wouldn't be such big jerks if it hadn't been for Terry. Kyle and his friends had, in fact, partnered with the other 3 for school projects, and found them pretty friendly when they were separated from Terry. Terry was just a mean kid. He was that kid from your childhood you just remember being unpleasant. His dad was the town dog catcher, and Terry could regularly be seen tormenting some of the ones he brought home. There were rumors that he'd killed a few of them, and if his treatment of Kyle and his friends were any indication, they believed it. The four rode up on their bikes, taking advantage of the freshly plowed road and leering at the boys' game. "Ooh, what you doing, sissies? Gonna play some make-believe?" Terry said, using his mocking tone. Carl and Reggie looked a little embarrassed, aware that what they were doing was a little babyish. But Kyle stood his ground and refused to be turned aside from his fun. "None of your business, Terry. Why don't you take your bike and get the heck out of here?" Terry grinned. "Who's gonna stop me if I don't, Gaylord? You gonna tell your mommy?" Kyle brandished his little plastic sword and drew himself up with all the bearing a 10-year-old could manage. "Don't you dare take one step into my yard, Terry, or I swear to God I'll beat the crap out of you." Reggie and Carl gave him a sidelong look, clearly not wanting to fight with Terry or his friends. As Terry let his bike fall to the pavement and took those first steps onto the snowy lawn, Kyle saw Reggie break for the house. He was saying something about telling Kyle's mom, but Carl just stood there, unsure whether to join him or not. Terry and his friends crunched through the fresh powder, not unsure about much of anything. Unfortunately, Terry wasn't one of those bullies that couldn't back up his threats. He was about a head taller than Kyle, and outweighed him by about 50 pounds. It wasn't fat either. Terry's dad expected chores to be done, and work to be completed after school, and Terry had a lot of muscle to back up his threats. When Kyle swung his lame little sword at him, Terry stepped aside and swung at him with a closed fist. Kyle stumbled sloppily aside, and Terry smacked against one of the snowmen instead, sending a big chunk of its body crumbling to the ground. Terry sucked in air and shook his ungloved hand, the cold snow stinging his skin. Kyle could see little drops of red where he had struck a pine cone or a rock in the snow. Kyle swung down then, hitting Terry's arm with the plastic blade and eliciting a little yap of pain and surprise from the bully. Kyle took a defensive stance, now a little more sure of himself, but it was already too late. Terry turned and socked him right in the nose with a right hook. Kyle stumbled backwards, seeing stars as he fell, crunching into the snow as Terry towered over him. "Well, go on then. Beat the crap out of me." Kyle didn't immediately get up. His nose was bleeding, and his head was foggy. 3 Terrys shifted slowly before his eyes, and as they walked closer, he tried to lift his arms in defense. He lay in the snow, the moisture creeping into the seat of his snow pants, and suddenly felt a cold glob of something hit him in the face. He pulled a shaky hand up and realized that Terry had spit on him. Pathetic. "Push some of these snowmen over, fellas. Let's teach him not to mess with us." His friends, who had been standing around looking uncomfortable, moved to do something that wouldn't get them in as much trouble as fighting. The snowman that had saved Kyle from Terry's first blow fell over wetly, the hard-packed snow needing very little convincing to rejoin the drift on the ground. Terry and his friends had pushed about 9 or 10 of the Snow Legion when Kyle heard his mom yelling from the porch. She was telling them to get the hell out of here as she crunched into the snow to see what had happened. Terry and his gang were away then, kicking over a few more snowmen in passing before jumping on their bikes and speeding away. Kyle's mom helped him up and brought the 3 boys inside so they could check Kyle's nose. After deciding that it wasn't broken, she gave them all hot cocoa as she tried to call Kyle's dad. She hung up with a disgusted head shake, telling Kyle to keep pinching his nose as he tried not to burn himself with the hot liquid. She said that she would have his father talk to Terry's father when he got home this evening, but all of them knew that that was a wasted effort. Terry's dad didn't care what his son did, and was the only person in town who was meaner than Terry. The snow had closed the schools early this year, so Terry would likely be back to stir up more trouble tomorrow. Kyle figured he'd just have to deal with it, but he wouldn't likely try to stand up to Terry again. Carl and Reggie made excuses to leave after that. Suddenly, the idea of playing in the yard didn't seem to appeal to them, and they left the armor behind as they walked back to their houses. Kyle told them that he'd see them tomorrow, but by the way they said they'd see, he didn't think he would. They'd been shamed and scared off by Terry, and Kyle doubted that they would be back to play until they all went back to school. He turned to see how many snowmen he had left, and was determined to replace the ones that Terry and his friends had knocked down. To his annoyance, Kyle found that only 4 had survived the attack, and one of them appeared to be the one that had bloodied Terry's knuckles. A chunk was missing, and the snow was stained a little pink where Terry had hit it, but it was still upright. Kyle packed the wound and gave the snowman a smile as he looked up into its lumpy features made out of rocks from the driveway. "Thanks, buddy. Guess you're my knight in shining armor, huh?" The snowman didn't respond, but Kyle hadn't really expected him to. He had rebuilt most of them when his dad got home, and he sighed as he looked at Kyle's face. Terry again? Terry had been picking on the kids who lived in the neighborhood since he was old enough to walk, and if you looked like someone had beaten the crap out of you, then it was probably Terry's doing. His dad said that he'd call Mr. Maslow, the roads being a little too rough to drive right now, and Kyle thanked him before returning to repairing his snow army as Dad went in to make the call. By the time the sun set, Kyle had about 30 snow knights ready for the battle the next day, and couldn't wait for tomorrow morning. When he came inside, he could hear his dad trying to talk to Terry's dad, and he winced as he pulled the phone away in the face of the yelling on the other end. Kyle took his place at the table, and a few minutes later, his dad joined them, still grumbling about the rude neighbors. His mom smiled at him and kissed his dad on the forehead, doling out a little extra roast for dealing with that old dragon. When Kyle went to bed that night, the snow flurries were falling outside the window, and the knowledge that tomorrow would be another snowy day to play in the fresh powder made him eager for the dawn. Kyle was up bright and early the next day to play in the snow. The armored snowmen were enemy soldiers, their leader wearing a solid black breastplate and sporting a stick mustache. All the snowmen, except for the one that had taken a punch for him yesterday. Kyle had decided that the snowman would assist him in battle, and they cut the other snow knights to pieces as they saved the snow prince from their evil leader. The snow knight didn't really help, of course. He watched Kyle's back as he hacked and slashed through the opposition, his own sword held firmly in hand. Kyle watched them fall to pieces with relish, his face red as his breath steamed in the cold air. Kyle was having too much fun to think about Terry that morning, and the bully didn't poke his head up to bother him until after lunch. Kyle had come outside after soup and sandwiches to find a new army of snowmen had been erected to stand against him and his friend. Kyle smiled, confused, but more pleasantly surprised than anything. He didn't question the appearance of the new snowmen. Maybe his dad had come home and decided to leave a little surprise for him. Kyle set about building an extra large snowman to be their evil leader, making him a set of bulbous arms and giving him some missing teeth from the driveway gravel. He was just carving the snow helmet with the tip of his sword, his breastplate looking large and sturdy with the sticks he'd added, when he heard the sound of rubber on concrete. Kyle tried to ignore it. Maybe it wasn't the sound of Terry's roadmaster as it turned the corner, but all illusions were shattered a moment later when Kyle heard the boy's standard greeting. "Hey, you gay lord, playing in the snow again?" he said in a fake baby talk way he liked to use. Kyle heard his friends laugh behind him as he said it, but he didn't turn around. If Terry wanted to beat him up, he'd have to do it in his yard and come trespassing. "What do you want, Terry?" Kyle asked, his nose still sore from the day before. "Just thought you'd like to know I got grounded for punching you in your stupid face yesterday." That surprised Kyle. He hadn't expected Terry's dad to do anything more than yell at him. The fact that he'd taken the time to tell Terry he was grounded was sort of refreshing. Clearly it hadn't worked, but hey, it was progress. "Good to know. So why are you here?" "We're looking for Dale," Bobby said, his voice sounding a little upset, despite Terry's angry look. "His mom said he never came home yesterday, and we were thinking—" "No, I haven't seen him either," Kyle assured him. "If I do, though, I'll point him home." "Whatever," Terry scoffed, and the three of them rode off on their bikes, cutting noisily up the snowy road. Kyle went back to building his snow knights, oblivious to the context of what was happening around him. That was how it had began. For the next week, Kyle played pretend in the yard. He saw the snowmen rise and fall, but the one that had pricked Terry remained standing. He was the colonel of the boy's army, the knight captain of his crusaders, the king of the kingdom, and any other leader Kyle needed. This didn't seem weird to Kyle at the time. He was just a kid and figured the snowman would be gone once the snow melted. They played every day, Carl and Reggie seeming to have lost their appetite for the snow, which was fine as long as Kyle didn't think about it. Who needed them anyway? Kyle had friends at hand anytime he built them. They searched for Dale for quite a while. His parents were worried that he'd been picked up by some kind of sex pervert or something. They never found his bike either, and the longer he remained missing, the more the police figured they would find him when the snow melted. Kyle's dad figured that he'd likely taken one of the curves on the mountain a little too sharply and slid under the guardrail. If Terry didn't push him off the cliff somewhere, he added, earning a smack from Kyle's mom and a quick glance at their son. Kyle agreed, but he pretended not to have heard since it seemed his mother didn't want him to get ideas. When Kyle went out the next day, he was surprised to see that the snowman was gone. It wasn't terribly upsetting. Snowmen melted, but Kyle had become quite attached to the fella. He had left the snow soldiers in the yard, guns and helmets dotting them, and it seemed like only the old snowman was gone. Kyle started to rebuild him, but decided instead to go see his friends. Carl had called to ask if he wanted to come play Super Nintendo at his house, and Kyle thought it might be nice to do something a little different. As he rode his bike, he rubbed his hands as the wind cut across him. Carl lived a little higher up on the mountain than he did, and as he passed the houses along the way, he couldn't help but notice the undisturbed snow in their yards. Kyle couldn't understand how anyone, adult or child, could look at all that snow and not feel moved to be out in it. As they cruised past Bobby's house, however, he could see that his yard had sprouted a couple of snowmen. Kyle wondered why he had helped Terry give him so much flack if he was fond of snowman building too, but he couldn't help but notice that Bobby's snowmen looked a little different. They were arrayed outside the house's windows, almost like they were peeking in, and it was a little spooky looking. Kyle put on a burst of speed, feeling a little weird about seeing it, like it was him peeking in instead of a bunch of snowmen. He pulled up in front of Carl's house and saw that Reggie's bike was already there. The two were sitting in his bedroom playing Goof Troop on the Super NES, and they waved at Kyle as he came in. Carl's dad was the superintendent for the school system in the area, and Carl had all kinds of cool stuff at his house. Reggie said he'd swap with Kyle when he died, and the three boys sat around and thwarted the efforts of Pirate Pete as they made their way through the levels. "Has Terry been bothering you lately?" Reggie asked, kicking a block into one of the fat pirates as he blocked their path. "Not really. I think his dad got mad when my dad called," Kyle said, spinning a Rubik's Cube in his hand half-heartedly. "Did you hear about Dale?" Carl asked quietly, as if he was afraid to talk too loudly about it. "Just that he's missing. Dad said they found his bike in a snowdrift. Said something had hit it hard enough to dent the front wheel." Did they find Dale?" Kyle asked, curious as to why he hadn't heard about the boy being found. "Nope, he's still missing. Sheriff Draper came to check the area, though. They think he might have fallen off when he hit whatever he hit. Dad thinks he might have been snatched." Kyle thought about this as they played, and as the sun started going down, he opted to head out before it got too dark. Carl's mom asked if he'd like to stay for dinner, but Kyle said that he had to get home or his mother would worry. He shivered as he climbed onto his bike, taking off as the cold air gave him a burst of speed. As he drove past Bobby's house, he saw that the snowmen were gone, and he wondered if Bobby had been the one to build them or not. When he pulled up in his own yard, Kyle was surprised to see that his snowman was back, right in the same spot it had been before. He was still wearing the breastplate that Kyle had put on him in the first place, but someone had replaced his plastic sword with a machete. His dad was probably having a goof. He had drawn his smile a little creepier than Kyle remembered it too, and as he walked up, he patted the snowman on the shoulder. "Good to have you back, partner." The body was rounder than it had ever been, but not quite round enough to hide something gray in the middle. Kyle pushed away a bit of snow and found a big rock in the center of the snowman's body. Kyle thought that was weird, but maybe Dad was trying to stop Terry and his friends from wrecking him up again. He went inside as the moon cast the yard in diamonds, but that night he had a terrible dream about his friend. He was sitting in the yard, flanked by a pair of snowmen who seemed to be leaking red stuff. Kyle wasn't sure if it was blood, but he was pretty sure it wasn't strawberry jelly. They were looking through his window, their coal eyes seeming very expressive, and when Kyle turned away, he could see their shadows growing tall on the wall. He peeked under the covers, looking through a slit in his comforter, and could see the heads of the two snowmen melting to reveal a pair of skulls with empty eye sockets. Kyle woke up with a start, but found his window empty. The next day, Kyle was playing in the yard when he heard Terry shout at him from the road. "Stay the hell out of my yard, Gaylord!" Kyle jumped and turned to look at him, startled by the sudden appearance. He hadn't heard the bike at all, and Terry usually came in loudly. He was alone today, none of his cronies having made the trip, and Kyle thought back to Bobby's yard the day before. Had he decided not to play with Terry after his behavior? Kyle doubted it, but it was possible. "What are you talking about?" Kyle asked, legitimately confused. He'd been here all morning, building snow knights for another battle, and his hands were wet and wrinkly under his gloves. He'd been planning on making another army to conquer, having found a plastic axe in his toy chest, and he was going to pretend to be Conan as he conquered the savage army. He was almost finished with a giant fella, the leader of this band of cannibals, when Terry had startled him. "Stop building snowmen in my yard," Terry repeated, letting his bike fall to the icy pavement as he took a step towards Kyle. "I know it's you. You're the only baby stupid enough to build these things. If I wake up one more night to find them peeking in my window, I'm gonna pound you," he said, shaking his fist at Kyle. He didn't seem to want to step into his yard, though, and the threat was sort of lame. Kyle ignored him, continuing to build his snow giant, and Terry eventually left. That night, his dad told him that Bobby had gone missing, too. "Strangest thing," he said, pouring gravy on his roast. "His folks said he went to take the trash out the day before and just never came back. They thought he'd gone to see Terry or Mark, but they started hunting for him and he didn't come back. The sheriff's pretty worried about it. The people are gonna want answers soon, and we're only a 3-officer town. There's no footprints either. Odd, since there's been no snow today. But there were some strange marks they'd thought might be tire tracks. Poor kid. Hopefully they find him." Kyle didn't eat much, wondering if he'd seen the vehicle that had taken Bobby. He didn't think he'd seen any cars that day, none that high up the mountain, and he hadn't passed any strange vehicles yesterday on his way back from Carl's house. He thought again about the snowman, but put it out of his head. Snowmen couldn't hurt anybody, they were just snow. The next day, Kyle saw a familiar truck pulling into the driveway. He was pulling his boots on, getting ready to go play after lunch, but he went back inside as a haggard bear of a man climbed out and walked towards the house. His dad was getting ready for work, the shifts having changed a little when the second kid went missing, and as Kyle came blundering into the kitchen, he narrowed his eyes at the door. He answered the angry knock and came eye to eye with Terry's father, Herschel Maslow. Herschel looked angry, angrier than Kyle had ever seen him. He staggered a little, likely drunk, but his eyes were bloodshot and angry. As the town dog catcher, he was supposed to stay sober while on the job, but that hardly seemed to matter to him. The mayor, his first cousin, usually smoothed over any problems he found with the police, but Herschel was a bomb just waiting to go off. He steadied himself against the doorframe before slurring out, "Keep your stupid brat off my property. I'm tired of hearing my boy whine about these damn snowmen." His dad looked at Kyle, but Kyle just shook his head. "Kyle, have you left the yard today?" Kyle shook his head again, but Herschel scoffed. "He's lying. I found 5 of them snowmen in my yard this morning. They just keep popping up, and Terry don't make 'em. Tell your kid to stay out of my yard, cop, else I'll shoot him as a trespasser next I see him." His dad looked like he meant to say more to Herschel, but the man stumbled off then, climbing into his truck as Kyle and his dad watched him go. Drunk bastard. Should pull him over right now. He looked down at Kyle for a moment before growling, "Make sure you stay away from the Maslow house, kiddo. He's a mean old drunk, but I think enough kids have gone missing so far without you getting shot for riding your bike." Kyle said he would, not intending to go anywhere close to that farm. The snowman was gone again when he came out to play, and Kyle wondered if Mr. Maslow had knocked him over. Kyle played in the snow for the rest of the afternoon, and as the sun began to sink towards dark, he heard a familiar squeal of tires. He started to head inside, not really wanting to be harassed by Terry today, but when someone called to him, he saw that it was Mark instead of the unpleasant young man. He pulled up in the yard, out of breath, sweat standing out on his forehead. "Hey, Kyle," he said, looking around fretfully. "Still, playing in the snow, huh?" Kyle nodded, looking behind him as though he expected to see Terry coming up on his bike, too. Could I ask a favor?" he said, looking behind him as if he thought something was following him. "I guess," Kyle said, looking to see what was chasing him. Terry's dad wasn't home, and Terry wouldn't ride with me to my house. Would you..." He looked torn, as if asking would make him feel weak. "Could you ride with me to my house? I hate to ask, but I feel kind of nervous about riding alone." Kyle thought about telling him to buzz off, but Mark seemed really shaken. He thought about it and figured that maybe Mark wouldn't mess with him if he owed him a favor. Besides, he could always ask Carl's mom if she could give him a ride, their house being just a few houses from Mark's. She would gladly drive him home, it being close to dark, and Kyle nodded, sticking his head in to tell his mom he was going to ride up to Carl's for a second. "Okay," he said, hopping on his own bike, "but let's be quick. It's almost dark." As the two took off, Mark seemed even more rattled than before. He kept looking behind them as they rode, and Kyle couldn't help but look as well. As the shadows gathered on the mountain, Kyle thought he heard something crunching in the snow behind them. He never got a good look at it, though. It moved quickly through the trees, its form hunched as it churned up the snow. Mark's teeth clicked together a little as he put on a burst of speed. "Something's following us," Kyle whispered, matching his speed. Mark didn't say anything. The two zipped up the mountain, and the edge yawned hugely beside them. This was the precipice, one of the edges that could send you tumbling off the side if you weren't careful, and the icy road made him wonder if he could stop in time if it came to it. It shrank away suddenly, and a few houses dotted the side, their windows lit with soft inner light. Kyle could still see the shadows following them, the three figures keeping up with them quickly, and when they rounded the next bend, Kyle stopped in confusion. It was his snowman, the one with the black breastplate, but the other two he didn't seem to recognize. They stood in the road, blocking the path, and the kids would be forced to ride between them to get farther up. Kyle had few qualms about moving between them, but Mark started to shake and mumble as he watched the three. No, not again. I'm not going out like that. Not like Bobby." He turned into the trees to their left and plunged in like a frightened deer. Kyle started to ask him what was wrong, but that's when he heard something grind against the pavement in front of him. It sounded like ice under someone's tires, and he turned back in time to see that the snowmen were gone. In the dying light, he thought he saw them disappear into the trees, and without thinking, Kyle plunged in after Mark. The boy's trail was easy to follow. The broken branches and tire tracks led him into the snow-covered woods. It was good that he had a trail to follow, otherwise he would have joined Mark at the bottom of the small holler. He had gone right over the edge in his haste, and he and his bike were at the bottom, lying in a heap. Kyle came down carefully, trying not to join him at the bottom, but when he got to him, he could tell the boy's arm was broken. "Can you move?" Kyle whispered, not sure why he was trying to be quiet. Mark groaned, sitting up as he hissed and pulled his arm in close. Around the holler, Kyle could hear something moving roughly through the snow. It churned it up, moving lumpily through the shadows, and as the boys huddled in the cup of the valley, the setting sun left them in twilight. Kyle tried to get an arm under him, wanting to help Mark out of the dell, but the boy pulled away, shaking his head as he touched his chest. "I think I broke something in the fall. My chest is on fire. My arm hurts too much." Kyle licked his lips, unable to figure out what to do. "What did you mean you weren't going out like Bobby?" he asked, looking around at the hunkered shadows that peeked in on them. "Bobby called me the day before he disappeared," he groaned, sitting down in the snow and scrunching his eyes shut. "He said he'd been seeing snowmen hanging around his house and was a little scared. We thought you were doing it, but the snowmen seemed to be moving, and he begged me to come over and make sure he wasn't going crazy. I would have too, but my mom didn't want me going out so close to dark. Then Bobby was gone. Kyle couldn't imagine that the snowmen were actually snatching kids, but the longer he watched them shuffle around the outside of the holler, the more he began to believe that something was going on. If I can't get you out, then I'll go get you help, Kyle said, Mark groaning in protest almost at once. Carl's house is right around the bend. If I can make it there quick, I can get you some help. I'll be right back. Just fend them off till then. It was a bad plan, but Kyle didn't really know what else to do. They would get both of them otherwise, and as Mark tried to stop him from going, he took off up the side of the bowl at a run. He expected roots to snag his feet or limbs to grab him as he ran, but nothing stood in his path. He kind of thought that the thing that had stalked them would come after him, but they never seemed to come after him. His fear of them seemed to be his only enemy, and as the trees pressed in around him, the sun plunged him into near total darkness. The silvery moon overhead provided little in the way of light, and as he ran, Kyle felt himself becoming hopelessly lost. It should have been easy to find his way out of the woods. They weren't very large, but it wasn't until Kyle saw a jumble of confusing lights that he finally found his way out of the trees. It was the bubble lights on his dad's police cruiser, and when he saw him, he pulled him in close, and Kyle could feel the tears as they soaked into his shoulders. I thought someone had gotten you. I thought for sure I'd never see you again. Kyle tried to tell him what had happened, but his dad was squeezing him too tightly for much beyond a few squeaks. When he finally stopped squeezing him, Kyle told him about Mark and the shapes in the woods. Get in the car, he said, putting Kyle in the back seat as he got on the radio and called for help. He clearly didn't believe that the snowmen had done this, but he believed that something was out there, and that it intended to take children. Despite the weather, 3 other squad cars soon came flashing up the mountain, and the sheriff had his dog in the back seat. Stay here, his dad said. You'll be safe in the back. We're going to see if we can find Mark. Kyle pushed his face against the window, watching them disappear into the trees. As he watched, his adrenaline spiking, he felt his eyes getting heavier and heavier. He fell asleep with his head against the door, and when the car rumbled to life sometime later, Kyle shook awake. His dad was driving, and another car was behind him as they went down the mountain. Where are we going? Kyle asked. His dad started as he seemed to realize that his son was still in the back seat. He seemed to be looking for the words, gonna take the murderer into custody. Kyle felt his blood run cold. Murderer? Had Mark been killed too? What did his dad mean? As they drove down the mountain, passing their own house, Kyle asked if they had found Mark. No, he said, strangely solemn, but we found drag marks. They went all the way down to, well, he seemed not to want to tell Kyle, but as they pulled into the Maslow property, he didn't have a lot of choice. We found him inside a snowman. Kyle heard someone shout and saw a very puffy-eyed Mr. Maslow as he was led away from his home in handcuffs. The sheriff and Deputy Frank were having trouble with him, but they were half tugging, half carrying him as he went towards the deputy's car, the sheriff's dog baying wildly in the back of his cruiser. Terry was being led away by Deputy Martin, and though uncuffed, he looked scared. As they pulled away, the sheriff told Kyle's dad to wait for the coroner so someone could get the bodies. Kyle's dad keyed up the mic and said that he would. They were inside the snowmen. There were 4 of them, one of them having only a rock inside. We don't know if it was Terry or Herschel, but one of them built those snowmen around those kids' bodies. I'm just glad we found you in time. His dad started to get out, but Kyle needed him to answer the question. What did the one with the rock in him look like? His dad, thinking he understood, nodded. It was wearing that black breastplate your snowman in the front yard was wearing. I think he might have been saving that one for you, but I'm not sure. The coroner pulled up then, and Dad climbed out. Kyle looked out the window, seeing the 3 destroyed snowmen, but he felt the gravel eyes of the 4th as it took him in. Kyle never forgot that winter. Mr. Maslow was sent to prison for murder, his cousin unable to smooth this over. Terry went to stay with relatives and was never seen on the mountain again. The house was put up for sale, but no one seemed to want it. When the snow caved the roof in 3 years later, they just destroyed it, and the property was still empty to Kyle's knowledge. Kyle moved to Boston after college, leaving behind the mountains and the harsh winters. He still enjoyed the snow, loving the way it piled in the yard as it fell, but he never played in it. Sometimes he thought he saw a battered old snowman in a black breastplate standing watch in his yard, but he never caught more than a glimpse of it. Kyle never thought much of it. Surely it couldn't be the same one. That had been years and years ago, and snowmen just didn't last that long. He went right on thinking that, until a coworker who fancied himself a bit of a bully suddenly went missing. They found him in a snowdrift during spring, and Kyle always wondered if he was to blame for the man's death. When the pandemic started, Kyle was glad to be able to work from home. He didn't want to risk another life at the hands of his white knight.